a fascination with sword fighting. I really do. And I have like 3 or 4 movies that I've watched where I love the scenes, the sword fighting scenes. They just stick out in my mind. And it started with Indiana Jones, I think maybe even before that. Somebody who knows all about swords, Domenic Melillo, joins us. He's an author of 3 popular books, Season of the Swords, Sword of the Great Champion, and this whole Swords of Valor book. So you have book 1 and 2, etc. And so he's had to do, obviously, a lot of research on swords. So who better to have on this show than Domenic? Domenic, thanks so much for coming on.
You're welcome, Kate. Glad to be here.
So I really am serious about that. I really am fascinated with sword fights, and I'm sure it does go back before that, but I can remember watching Raiders of the Lost Ark, and there's a lot of great moments in that movie, but the swordsman, oh my gosh. And of course, when you see clips of it, a lot of times that is the scene that's shown. So we all had a fascination with it, and it wasn't lost on Steven Spielberg. It was just brilliantly done. And I think that opened up a whole generation of people being fascinated with swords. So what is it about sword fighting that intrigues us so much when we see it, especially on the big screen?
You know, I think the first thing is that there's such diversity to it, right? You see a sword fight in one movie, and it's not as if you've seen them all. They take place in so many different locations. There's different ways to approach it. There's different types of swords. There's different types of warriors that fight. Different times, medieval sword fights. Things in the Crusades. We've seen Game of Thrones, right? There was a lot of sword fighting taking place there. We've seen it in fantasy. We've seen it in real life, like Civil War times. It's hard to be original, especially on the screen. But Star Wars did it, right? I mean, they came up with lightsabers. So for me, I'm probably older than you. So when Star Wars came out, that was kind of the first time I'd really seen much that type of level of sword fighting, but it was done with lightsabers. So my mind went crazy. Was like, whew, went nuts. I'd always had a fascination with swords. I remember my grandparents telling me that the only thing I wanted when they took me to the circus was some tin sword that was hanging off a concession stand somewhere. I mean, I must have been 3, 4 years old. That's all I wanted. Didn't want anything else. So it's been fascinating. But I think, you know, there's danger, there's artistry, there's footwork. It's a ballet, yet it's a lethal ballet that takes place. And I think that's part of the fascination.
I like that, a lethal ballet, absolutely. So in researching swords, do you say, and you just talked about it, what it's like, and I mentioned how I think it's so powerful on the big screen, do you think that the movies really portray the sword fights pretty good? Do you think they're done pretty well?
You know, I think today they are. I think the choreography is amazing. In fact, the first one that comes to mind for me is the sword fight in Troy, in the movie Troy. Right? I mean, I thought that was incredible. Today, it's still the first one that comes to my mind out of everything, you know, where you've got Eric Bana, who's Hector, and Achilles, you know, Brad Pitt. And the tension has built over the course of the movie. And, you know, now the confrontation has to take place. And you've got Hector, who is really not going to, he doesn't have that much of a chance against Achilles, but he goes in there. And there's bravery and there's drama. And the musical score in the background is just pounding, the drums, the heavy drums, and then the clashing of swords. Oh, and the movement. In fact, I don't know what kind of mechanical devices they use, but the leaps that you see from Brad Pitt at the very beginning when they're stalking each other and circling each other like 2 tigers, you know, in a pit. And then he leaps and he stabs at him with I can't even, I get so excited about it. It was incredible. That was incredible. In the movie 300, there was a lot of good sword work there. So for me, that's the one. I think they do it very well today. I think in the past, when you saw some of the gladiator movies from the 50s, not so much. But today, I mean, Game of Thrones.
Yeah, it's a great example.
Like I said, Troy, just really good.
Yeah,
really good stuff.
I can think of one, Madonna, where she was fencing in Die Another Day. If people are listening, you go and look at that scene. I'm sure you can find it because Madonna's always everywhere anyway. But I'm sure on YouTube and wherever, it's all over. And I thought that was a pretty cool scene too, where it was they had all the fencing gear on, but it was what you described, sort of like a ballet, and you weren't sure. There was some high drama there, so to speak. I thought it was really, really good. Really well done.
Well, I hadn't seen that one, actually. I don't know. Maybe because I'm not much of a Madonna fan, but I have to go look at that.
Yeah, I'm a James Bond fan, so I've seen all the Bond films, and that was one of the... And see, of course, because I like swords, that really stuck out for me for sure. We're speaking with Domenic Melillo. He's the author of several popular books, Season of the Swords, Sword of the Great Champion, and so really the Swords of Valor is what it is, book 1 and book 2. So for you doing this research and putting these books together, what was that like?
Oh, that was a blast. That was incredible. Of course, I had already had kind of a lot of sword background information in my head, from years of movie watching, reading, studying, and just having fun with it, just being interested in it. But putting it all together, what's interesting in the trilogy is that the swords obviously are the critical devices that the heroes use throughout all 3 books of the trilogy. By the way, the last book of the trilogy, The Sword Above All, just came out. Yesterday was the release date. So that's out there on Amazon, too. So
there you go.
Complete trilogy is out there. But the Swords of Valor are really swords, historical swords. Well, historical swords in the sense that everybody would kind of know these swords, whether it's Excalibur or the Sword of Solomon or the Sword of William Wallace. Those are examples of, the swords of valor that have come down through history, and the guardians of the swords of valor, which our heroes are, use them to the benefit of mankind. And they're imbued with different virtues and that sort of stuff. But so what I did was I really had to get deeper into the research about each of these historical swords. What did they look like? What were their characteristics? Who wielded them, and what was the characteristics of the person who this belonged to? Charlemagne, the sword of Charlemagne, the sword of Roland. And you go back and you research the legends and so and then I apply the different virtues from those heroes to the swords themselves. Anyway, so that type of research for me was just joyful. It was actually a joyful project for me.
Do you have, and this has got to be hard because now you said you had 3, so it's all wrapped up, and just want to make sure people know that, Swords of Valor, this whole series. Do you have a favorite story? Do you have a favorite sword? Because I think that would be hard because of all the research and the history that you're learning is really fascinating, but there may be one that stuck out for you.
Well, my favorite sword in the books, believe it or not, is one that I kind of made up. Didn't really make it up, but it's the sword of Don Quixote, right? Everybody thinks of Don Quixote as having, tilting at windmills, and he's got, armor, and he's got a spear, but he also had a sword. Not many people kind of remember that, but it was old, and it was one of the Spanish rapier types, so it wasn't very strong. It was thin. It wasn't quite a fencing sword type thing, but it was, it was a rapier, so it's thinner. And that becomes critical, especially in the first book. And it's owned in the book by the grandfather, but it comes to the aid, and it's the sword that the most unassuming sword, the sword of humility, that steps up and takes the day and saves the day for the heroes. So for me, that's my favorite sword, and I actually have that sword in my office because actually all of the swords in the book. You can look them up, and a lot of them you can actually buy replicas of from a company in Spain called Marto, M-A-R-T-O. Beautifully made swords, expensive but beautiful artwork. And so I bought the sword of Don Quixote, and that's mine. It sits here in my office.
Oh, I love that. You have the sword, Don Quixote, and it's funny, it just immediately, as soon as you say that, it just conjures up these images. So when people read these books, what do you hope they feel? What do you hope they take away from this?
I wrote these books as kind of an alternative timeline history of my family, my actual family. So all of the characters in the books are my family members. And I go back and I reconstruct our history, and I add some fantasy to it. Like who we're related to. And there's at the death of the grandfather, the patriarch of the family, the heroes are called to, together by their uncle, and who tells them their real history, the real history of their family, that their grandfather was the leader of this Guardians of the Swords of Valor, and that they have their great ancestors were Cincinnatus from Rome and Joseph of Arimathea, and that they've been charged with guarding these swords of valor, and that there's this crisis and they have to take over. So really, that's the original. I wrote it as kind of an alternative timeline history from my family. But when I write things, I write them with a purpose. And there's the main themes in my stories are virtue and valor, liberty and freedom, and the value of human virtue, individual virtue, as well as virtue in society. And how it relates to freedom and liberty, because freedom and liberty cannot exist without virtue and valor.
Perfect place to end this. Pick up these books. You can go through the whole series, the Swords of Valor series. Domenic Melillo, thank you so much.
Kate, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.